Imagine Ireland as Europe's tech-savvy cousin. The country is relatively youthful, with a median age of 38. It's well off, boasting a GDP per capita among the top 10 on the planet. And it's all about big tech, with the likes of Apple Inc. and Microsoft Corp. making a significant chunk of its workforce and tax revenue. But just like those tech billionaires in Silicon Valley, Ireland still has some growing pains to work through. If you were to ask around about the economy's biggest shortcomings, housing and employment would likely top the list. Bottlenecks seem to be everywhere you turn. Sure, every country deals with these issues to some extent, but Ireland's history of underinvestment and poor planning really sets it apart on the global stage. But let's not dive straight into the doom and gloom of the Irish economy just yet. Let's start with a glimmer of hope. Remember the good old days of the Celtic Tiger when Ireland was the envy of the world? It was between the years 1993 to 2001 when Ireland caught up to its formerly far more wealthy EU neighbours. The economy expanded during those 8 years at a rate never seen before in European history. Economists, policymakers and business people appropriately place a high priority on the contribution that labour productivity growth, or output per worker, makes to economic expansion. Between these years, Ireland's productivity per worker increased by more than 5% annually, or nearly half as much. It increased at only 1/3 of that rate in other parts of Europe. Of course, the entrance of nearly 300 new high-tech industrial ventures in Ireland during that 8-year period played a significant role in this. These enhanced the manufacturing output by about 5 times, tripled the amount of exports, and above all, nearly quadrupled the reported monetary value of the average industrial worker's output. But labour productivity doesn't explain this whole successful period. It just explains part of it. Where did the remaining portion of this enormous increase in the purchasing power come from? Well, it's the result of an extraordinary nearly half-fold rise in the labour force, which involved placing a large number of people who had previously been unemployed in paid work. A sizable percentage of people who had left Ireland during the 1980s financial crisis also came back during this time to work in Ireland. And things didn't improve a few decades later, as Ireland didn't escape the global economic downturn of 2008 to 2009. As it happened in America, Britain and other nations, a real estate purchasing boom was driven by rising earnings and employment from the 1990s, as well as by low-cost financing and tax incentives. This increased housing costs and spurred a boom in new home construction. When the housing bubble eventually broke, prices plummeted from their previously unimaginable heights. Due to this, Ireland's banks, who had provided large-scale real estate loans, were severely exposed. With 6 of the country's largest banks on the verge of bankruptcy, the Irish government made the decision to insure their debt, which was estimated to be worth $572 billion. But as property values dropped more, the losses increased along with the obligations the government had to assume. The Irish bond market and national finances were weakened by this. A growing amount of debt in Ireland alarmed foreign investors, who wanted higher interest rates to offset the increased risk. Beyond their ever-expanding loan guarantees, the Irish government went one step further and nationalised the Anglo-Irish Bank in January 2009. In 2008, Ireland's sovereign debt was only 45% of GDP. By 2009, it was at 65%. That year, the GDP of Ireland decreased by 7.6%, and in 2010, the EU and the IMF provided an $85 billion bailout as a result of the financial developments that snowballed. Ireland needs to put into effect a strict austerity programme in order to receive the bailout from the EU and IMF. Along with cutting jobs in the public sector and imposing a new property tax, the government also lowered the minimum wage. So, you're probably scratching your head wondering how Ireland dodged the recession and bounced back. Let's dive into a few factors that led to this epic comeback. But before we go into it, if you like this video so far, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel. First factor to consider is foreign direct investment, or FDIs. The foreign corporations operating in Ireland and the global economic recovery had a major role in Ireland's recovery from the debt crisis. Following 2016 and the election of President Trump, significant shifts started to occur on both sides of the Atlantic. Ireland's success as a small, export-focused, globally oriented economy has been largely attributed to FDIs, which also offers extra direct and indirect advantages to the larger business environment. Over 275,000 individuals are directly employed by FDI companies. In 2021, enterprises sponsored by IDA Ireland announced record employment. Moreover, FDI businesses greatly boost Irish exports and account for 80% of corporate tax receipts. According to the EY European Investment Monitor, Ireland is still one of the top 10 destinations for foreign direct investment in Europe, accounting for 3% of all FDI investments in 2021. Of these top 10, Ireland has the greatest number of projects per capita. But you know what's more amazing? US businesses accounted for 59% of all Irish FDI projects. This shows the strength of the US-Ireland relationship and possibly hinting at a chance to enhance the number of projects obtained from other regions. The total estimated value of American investments in Ireland in 2022 was $574.32 billion, which is huge. Software and IT services are the largest project creators, followed by businesses and professional services, and Ireland continues to be a preferred destination for international headquarters and global business service investments. That's just wow. But what makes it so attractive? Well, Ireland's quality of life, business-friendly climate, education system, and tax policy are all considered as major factors contributing to their attraction. Ireland scored quite well on sustainability-related variables, with availability of talents to support sustainability projects is on par with or better than the European norm. Both the legislation encouraging sustainable company practices and the funding options for sustainability projects received good marks as well. Second factor to consider is exports and trade. Ireland's economy is one of the most open and export-oriented in the whole planet, with the GDP reaching over $533 billion in 2022. Ireland, with a per capita GDP of $103,534 in 2022, is a prosperous net exporting nation. Well, it's difficult to exaggerate the significance of exports to Ireland's economy. As a tiny open economy, commerce gives Ireland access to markets for its output and to goods that are not easily accessible, which eventually raises everyone's standards of life. For example, the Celtic Tiger years were based on the expansion of exports, and in 2010 to 2011, after the financial crisis, exports gave Ireland a way to resume positive economic growth. Exports of products and services accounted for over 110% of the Irish GDP in 2014, compared to 85% in 2000. Those numbers, which are over 3 times the average for the European Union, both then and now highlight how dependent Ireland is on trade flows. Since 2000, services have accounted for the majority of export growth. From 2000 to 2014, exports increased by 96%, with services making up a significant portion of this growth. Since the year 2000, the composition of Irish exports has changed due to the rapid rise of service exports. 80% of all Irish exports in 2000 were goods exports. This proportion dropped to 53% in 2014. A third factor to consider: international bailout funds. When the Irish government approached the IMF and the EU for assistance back in November 2010, they jointly provided loans worth €67.5 billion, or 40% of Ireland's GDP. Following the IMF's advice, banks merged, hired few people, and eventually assets and deposits were more closely linked. The IMF sent in specialists from the US and Norway to provide guidance on loan modifications and working with mortgage borrowers who had fallen behind on their payments. Then, the nation's public finances were the second priority after the banks. Over a period of 3 years, the administration outlined a plan to lower the budget deficit. Among these were reductions in the civil service, savings and capital investment, the addition of supplemental personal income tax, and hikes in the value-added, carbon and motor vehicle taxes. All of these actions added up to 8% of GDP. Not bad. By maintaining the majority of welfare spending and negotiating with stakeholders, the administration was able to win over the public to these strict policies, and it seems that these strict measures were bearing fruit. The Irish economy started to rebound by 2012, when the programme's second year came to a close. When businesses decide to invest, unemployment begins to go down. Dublin house prices began to rise, banks' areas were cut in half, and the government entered the financial markets again. In 2018, the employment rate had fallen back to being below 6%. Good job, Ireland. You should note that the Irish government, the European Union, and the IMF worked together to achieve this amazing recovery of the nation. Although Ireland was caught up in the global financial crisis, its issues were domestic, and domestic remedies were needed to bring the country's finances back into balance, restructure institutions, and settle a pile of bad debts. The Irish government was in charge, but the EU and IMF offered financing and guidance. It's all pots of gold in Ireland with their economic successes, right? But hold on a second. If we dig a little deeper, we'll see problems and challenges bubbling up. In this video, we talk about 3 main challenges. Challenge number 1. For more than 10 years, Ireland has struggled with a serious housing crisis that is characterised by a lack of acceptable and affordable housing, growing housing costs, and an increase in homelessness. The nation's economy as a whole, as well as individuals and families, have all been significantly impacted by this catastrophe. Many interrelated issues contribute to Ireland's housing crisis. These issues include a high demand, limited supply, affordability issues, and planning changes. In terms of housing demand, the housing market is under more strain due to Ireland's population growth, which has been steady. The need for rental accommodations has been increasing due to urbanisation, immigration, and other factors. Meanwhile, there is a severe scarcity of available properties as a result of the building of new homes not keeping up with demand. This shortage is particularly acute in metropolitan locations, where there is a strong preference for single-family houses and insufficient availability of land for development. Along with the crazy high demand and low supply, housing costs are soaring. With hikes of 20% in some locations, Irish rental prices had the largest increase in history in 2022, sparking concerns about the possible effects on the country's overall economy. This has made it extremely difficult for families to afford a home. This is caused by a number of things, such as low wages, growing construction costs, and high property prices. The affordability crisis has notably hit first-time purchasers and low and middle-income individuals. On top of that, the housing issue has also been exacerbated by planning laws and government initiatives. Urban zoning regulations have restricted the amount of land available for construction, and the emphasis on pricey private homes has resulted from the movement towards market-led development. Now that you know how big the housing issue is, you should note that there are significant consequences of this housing problem on people, families, and the nation at large. Over the past few years, there has been a significant rise in the number of individuals facing homelessness. More than 11,000 people, many of them families with small children, were living in emergency housing in 2023. On top of that, the housing crisis exacerbates stress, worry, and depression, which are major effects on mental health. Feelings of instability, uncertainty, and despondency are on the rise due to the shortage of affordable housing. In addition, it goes without saying that the issue has detrimental effects on the economy since it impedes productivity and economic progress. People may be forced to relocate if they are unable to find cheap housing, which would result in a skills shortage and decreased economic activity. To alleviate the housing crisis, the Irish government has launched a number of measures. The Housing for All is an incentive by the government to add 33,000 new affordable dwellings annually to the stock of housing. Also, a rent assistance program called Housing Assistance Payment (HAP) assists low-income households to afford private rental housing. In addition, the government implemented revenue-raising measures. These are tax policies designed to reduce institutional investors' sway over the housing market. These initiatives are good, can't deny it, but the housing situation cannot be solved by the government's actions, despite considerable progress being made. Long waiting lists, a lack of coordination, and limited money are just a few of the issues that existing policies and programs have to deal with. This issue of housing takes us to challenge number 2. Young people in Ireland have valid concerns over the country's economy. It's reasonable to argue that the Irish economy is failing young people if an increasing percentage of workers are unable to meet their basic housing needs. Today, there are 250,000 fewer workers under 40. This reflects the fact that young people are not as represented in the workforce as they were 15 years ago. In 2022, the youth unemployment rate in Ireland decreased. Nevertheless, the previous 2 years recorded a significantly higher youth unemployment rate. Housing is a crucial component of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which outlines what individuals must have in order to live fully, feel safe, and satisfy their basic psychological and biological needs. It's legitimate to argue that the Irish economy is failing young people if an increasing percentage of workers are unable to meet basic necessity. Now, before we go into challenge number 3, take this. Ireland's GDP grew by 12.2% in 2022 compared to other Eurozone's overall increase of 3.5%. Only Germany, France, and Italy made greater absolute contributions to the GDP growth of the Eurozone in 2021 and 2022 than Ireland did. Ireland's economic boom has allowed the government to report a 1.6% GDP budget surplus, whereas the average deficit for Eurozone countries has been above 3%. Let me ask you a question. Who wouldn't want this Irish luck? Really? But if you look closely, Ireland's apparent economic miracle seems a little strange. The nation is growing in a real and artificial way at the same time. A small number of American multinational corporations are mostly responsible for it. They continue to channel sales and earnings throughout their Irish operations in order to benefit from Dublin's lower company taxes. Apple's transfer of intellectual property assets to Ireland is thought to have contributed half of Ireland's astounding 26% GDP growth in 2016. That's crazy. It's also true that American investments in Ireland has increased. During the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular, Ireland's significance as a centre for the manufacturing of medications expanded significantly. Ireland hosts sizable production facilities for the 9 of the 10 top pharmaceutical corporations in the world. Ireland's reliance on American tech and pharmaceutical companies for investment and taxation cannot be overstated, with corporate tax revenues accounting for 27% of all tax revenue in 2022. Corporate tax revenue is currently the Irish state's second largest source of tax revenue, behind income tax. For the Irish government, this is a crazy flood of tax revenue. Revenues from corporate taxes increased by almost 50% alone in 2022. Ireland's issue is that it's becoming more vulnerable to threats as a result of this single reliance. Consider the computer industry. The decline in revenues and global employment losses seen by corporations such as Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta would not only negatively impact the Irish economy, but also rob Dublin of tax revenue. To sum up, over the past few years, Ireland has experienced rapid economic growth. However, for the Irish economy to continue, a number of potential macroeconomic and fiscal issues that could affect it during the next 5 years need to be resolved. While international conditions are still good, economic weaknesses must be methodically addressed in order to establish a medium-term environment for strong and sustained economic growth. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to receive more content. See you in the next video.